All right. So let's continue now with our next exciting lightning talk. And this time, Kyle Cucci is going to talk about malware analysis to drive threat hunting and detection engineering. Really looking forward for his talk. And Kyle Cucci is currently leading the malware research team at a large global bank. His daily activities include reverse engineering of malware, researching threats affecting the finance in the banking industry, and also making really cool PowerPoint presentations. In his spare time, Kyle enjoys spending time together with his wife and son, and also playing around with all the latest open source tools. And really looking forward to for you to share your insights on what you've been learning and how you can actually extend your malware research capabilities in order to drive threat hunting. Kyle, are you ready to talk?
Yes, Dan, thanks. Can everyone hear me? Or
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, cool.
Yes.
No one else can talk, so I guess you're the only one who can prove that. Give me 1 second here. So I've kind of got my presentations in a Windows VM because I'm on Linux right now. So I did pay attention to Rory's talk, though. I should be running this in a container, but I'm doing it in a VM. Just a second, please. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Great. Okay, I'm also going to have up the chat in the other window just in case. So like Rory, like Dan said earlier, this talk was originally designed to be a lightning talk, but since we probably have a little bit more time, I think, right, Dan? Extra couple minutes?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, cool. Okay, great. This talk will probably be about 15 to 20 minutes of me talking because I love hearing myself talk so much. And then, but we can basically open up the Q&A for anyone, and I'll be monitoring that. So if there's any questions during my talk, I'm happy to answer them as well. But yeah, let's kick it off. So my talk today is entitled "How Malware Analysis Can Guide Threat Hunting and Detection Engineering." I'm actually really excited to be here. So a little bit about myself. As Dan already mentioned, I'm leading the malware research team at a large German bank. I just say large German bank here, not because I don't want to reveal where I work, but because I want to keep the focus off of strictly finance and banking, because Frankfurt is a lot of finance and banking, if you haven't heard. And it's nice to kind of generalize this a little bit more and kind of keep it away from the finance aspect. My daily focus is on researching malware, reverse engineering, mostly financial and banking related threats, and dabbling in threat intelligence and threat hunting a little bit. And in my spare time, as Dan also already said, I like to play with the latest security tools, spend time with my wife and kid. I do run once in a while, and I like to write and blog for fun. So I'm a nerd, so I love doing that. My Twitter handle and LinkedIn are on the right-hand side if you want to get a hold of me for any reason or ask any questions after this presentation. So what we're going to discuss today is some of the common issues in developing hunt and detection use cases, and most importantly, how malware analysis can help with designing hunt and detection use cases. We're going to go into what is and isn't malware analysis. We'll talk about how we can use malware to drive our use case design and engineering. And last but not least, we'll talk about IOC abstraction. Right now, IOC abstraction probably means nothing to you, but by the end of the presentation, you will be an expert in IOC abstraction. So some of the problems with designing use cases. First and foremost, before I begin, I should mention that when I say use cases here, I mean generic. This is a generic term for threat hunt or detection rule. So a use case could be a threat hunting use case, or it could be a detection rule use case. But it's difficult to build quality and relevant use cases for your organization. By quality, I mean it's difficult to develop use cases that are tailored to your organization, that your organization should care about. And generally, this is a difficult task. Why this is difficult, though, is because it's hard to gather specific technical data points and intelligence around what you should actually be detecting and hunting for. Tools like MITRE ATT&CK are really, really good, but they have their own set of problems. One of those is that it's very generalized. So MITRE ATT&CK is very, it's not targeted to any specific organization or to any specific sector, right? I mean, what's affecting the banking industry is going to be different than automotive. That's going to be different than the government industry or the hospitality industry. And MITRE just says, you know, focus on everything, and here's the techniques that you should detect, and just detect everything. And it's really hard to get guidance out of this. Like, where should you focus? This kind of leads to poor prioritization of your use cases and which use cases you choose to implement. And my proposal here is to use malware analysis to help guide your hunting and detection. Let's get into that a little bit more. So the meme on the right actually has nothing to do with malware. I just thought it was kind of funny. And because it's an InfoSec presentation, so a meme is required at least one. The goals of malware analysis are to understand a malware's key behaviors, assess the impact of an infection and attack. So basically, when you're analyzing malware, you want to understand what the malware's capabilities are, and of course, what the potential impact to your organization could be. And then finally, or not finally, the next point is how you can identify some containment and remediation measures for this malware. So if this malware were to compromise your environment, what could you do to immediately contain this and to remediate this malware infection? And finally, the most important aspect to this talk here is malware contains key, I'll say intelligence, but we'll talk about intelligence in a minute. But it contains key intelligence such as indicators of compromise and techniques that threat actors are using inside the malware that can be extracted. One important point is that whenever I talk about malware analysis, it seems like that it seems beyond the scope of many organizations. A lot of organizations I speak to, they say they don't have a dedicated malware analyst, they don't have a reverse engineering team. Well, it doesn't really take a dedicated malware analyst team or reverse engineering team to analyze malware. You basically need one dedicated analyst, such as a senior SOC analyst or a threat hunter, and a sandbox, such as Cuckoo, or one of the other commercially available ones. But Cuckoo is a good open source free one. This is all it really takes to begin malware analysis. Yes, it's a very specialized subject, and you can spend years and years and years learning malware analysis, but the basics can be grasped relatively quickly, just like any discipline. But malware analysis does have its limits. So threat intelligence people are quick to tell me that malware is not intelligence. And that is true to a certain extent, because malware only gives you a point-in-time picture of an attack. So, for example, if you find malware in your environment, like maybe your antivirus detected a malware threat and it blocked it, for example, and you obtain that malware and analyze it, this is just one piece of the whole attack puzzle, because there may be multiple stages involved. There may be, for example, an Office document which drops an executable, which then does some things in memory, maybe some fileless activities. Finally, ransomware will be deployed, or some final payload. So you basically have one point in time that you're analyzing. However, you can still kind of move forward and backwards in time from this one malware sample. You can get clues that will kind of help you understand the full attack, not as well as if you had every stage of the attack, but it will help you clue into what you can look for next in your environment in order to detect the further stages of the attack. So designing use cases using malware analysis. Why would we want to do that? So first of all, malware contains concrete indicators and techniques to guide hunting and detection engineering. The word concrete here is important because when we're talking about tools like MITRE ATT&CK, MITRE ATT&CK, as I mentioned, provides a great overview of the techniques that your organization should be detecting, but it doesn't tell you exactly what you should implement. Like MITRE ATT&CK will say, you should detect PowerShell, you should detect obfuscated PowerShell commands, or you should detect WMIC executing whatever, or you should detect this and that. But it doesn't tell you how you should detect that. It doesn't show you the commands that can be used by PowerShell to obfuscate or to remain stealthy on the endpoint. And that's the main problem with things like MITRE ATT&CK. They're very general in this case. Malware, however, though, will have very specific indicators and techniques that you can immediately use to guide hunting and detection. These techniques within malware, or these IOCs, will often cover many areas of MITRE ATT&CK and can complement MITRE ATT&CK. And if your malware sources are good, and we'll talk about good malware sources versus bad malware sources later on in this presentation, but malware is inherently relevant to your organization. So by this, I mean it's automatically relevant to you, because if you see malware in your environment, for example, if your antivirus triggers on an alert for malware, or your users are receiving malware to their inboxes via spam emails or whatever, your organization is seeing this malware, meaning that whatever techniques or behaviors or TTPs or whatever you call them are in this malware, it's important for your organization to detect this. And so if we look at MITRE ATT&CK, for example, there's hundreds and hundreds of techniques in MITRE ATT&CK. I think it's hundreds now, but there's many techniques in MITRE ATT&CK, but not all of them are relevant to your organization. But if you're looking at a specific malware sample that your organization has seen already, it's relevant to your organization. So where can we get malware for our organization? End users. So end users are a great source of malware because they love to click on things like macros. If you have some kind of a mechanism to automate this process, it makes it a lot easier. What kind of mechanisms I'm talking about are, for example, a button in your Outlook email. For example, it says, send email to SOC, or send to Information Security Operations Group, or report spam, report malware, report something, whatever. This process should be a little bit automated, so that way your end users can send malware to your SOC, or to your malware analysis team, or to your threat hunting team for analysis. This kind of goes along the lines of, the email gateway and email threat monitoring solution. So if you have a email threat monitoring solution that's scanning inbound emails for potential malware, this is another great source. And this kind of goes along with the end users aspect. But because many malware samples, dare I say most malware, is being delivered in emails nowadays, and in spam-related emails typically, sometimes targeted, but mostly mass spam, especially when you're dealing with commodity malware. So this is a great source of very relevant malware for your organization. The idea here is to obtain this malware before your end users get it, analyze the malware, extract the IOCs and behaviors and techniques that the threat actors are using inside this malware, and then develop detections and threat hunting scenarios before your users actually even open this file. So antivirus is another great place where you can get malware. If you have some kind of a central quarantine set up. So for example, if you're using Symantec or Windows Defender or Avira or Kaspersky or whatever antivirus you're using, set up some kind of a quarantine server where all of the alerts in your environment are automatically sent to this quarantine server, where hopefully your threat hunting team or malware analysis team or SOC will have access to. They can pull these files from quarantine and then analyze them, submit them to a malware sandbox like Cuckoo, and extract the techniques that the threat actors are using. Endpoint detection response is the same way. If your EDR solution, if you have an EDR solution, that's you would think it's normal to have EDR right now, but in a lot of organizations, they still don't have EDR. So this is not exactly a baseline thing yet. But if you're lucky enough to have EDR, you can automate the process, of course, of if EDR catches a malicious file executing, see if you can send that to a central quarantine. Network threat protection. This goes along the lines of, for example, FireEye MX, things like this. Basically, inline threat protection solutions on the network. A lot of these solutions can detect malware that's being sent over the wire, and you can automate the process. I know FireEye can do it, for example, of setting up a quarantine server where these files can be sent to. And then this is a great pipeline, part of the pipeline for your malware analysis. And then finally, external threat feeds and sharing partners. I can't stress enough the value of mainly sharing partners. Threat feeds are good as well, But threat feeds are not always relevant to your organization unless it's a very targeted threat feed. But sharing partners are great if you can get involved with a malware sharing group or at least a threat intelligence sharing group around your sector. Like, for example, in ISAC, like in finance, we have FS-ISAC, where we would share malware samples and intelligence with the other members of the community. And this is great because for example, if you work for an automotive company, for example, and one of your competitors receives well, in this case, sharing partner, not competitor, one of your sharing partners receives a malware file that's worth looking into, they can send it to you for investigation, and then you would also have that intelligence. So what can you get from malware in malware analysis? Lots of things. So let's look at these a little bit. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse. Let me see if I can. Can you see my mouse, Dan?
Yes, we can see your mouse.
Okay, yep. Cool. I didn't know if I should switch to the laser pointer or whatever. One of the main things we can get from malware is network comms, network communications. So this could be command and control communications, malware sending commands to, a master sending commands to its malware slaves. Or it could be an additional download. A lot of malware called droppers will download additional malware and drop it, so to speak, on the endpoint. This is another network communication that you can analyze in malware and develop a technique, a detection or threat hunt for. Malware loves creating, deleting, and modifying files in the file system. Cuckoo is really good at this. The malware sandbox Cuckoo, as well as most commercial sandboxes, will list out all of the behaviors, all of the file system behaviors of the malware. And if you see that the malware is creating a file with an interesting file name, you can hunt for this file within your environment. And this is a good indication of this malware in your environment. Command execution behaviors. So is the malware launching PowerShell with a certain command or certain obfuscation technique? Or is the malware launching a Windows living off the land binary like WMIC or WMI or MSHTA or any of these lol bins, as they call them? These are great indicators because you can develop really nice threat hunts and detections based off of these type of command execution you see in malware. Persistence. Almost all malware will try to establish persistence because malware is expecting, unless it's infecting a server, malware is expecting a lot of words here. Malware is expecting users to reboot their system from time to time. You know, if a user goes home at the end of the day, their system shuts down and they reboot. And if the malware did not establish persistence, the malware would basically not be on this host anymore. It would just be gone. So malware wants to establish some kind of reboot persistence in the form of a scheduled task or a registry autoruns key or various other methods. And persistence mechanisms are a great way to set up a hunt or a detection based on the way malware is establishing persistence. Process creation and process injection. So process creations, sometimes malware will spawn processes on the endpoint that are very interesting. One malware that I analyzed recently was trying to spoof Windows processes. It was basically, if anyone's familiar here with SVC host, which is a common Windows 10 and Windows 7 process, this malware was calling it SVC host, but the O was replaced with a 0. So it was kind of hard for an end user to notice that. However, if you run a threat hunt across your organization or write a detection rule for a process that has SVC host with a 0 in it, that's a really, really good indication that something suspicious is going on in this endpoint. Registry modifications. I already spoke about this a little bit in persistence. Registry modifications could be related to persistence. Also, fileless malware likes to write code to the registry that could be executed later in memory. So this is also a good way to establish a hunt. If you find that, if you analyze malware and see that it's writing specific code to the registry, you can basically scan your entire environment, depending on what kind of EDR tools you have to do this or what kind of orchestration tools, but you can scan your environment looking for this specific code in registry. And finally, static file properties. Static file properties are more difficult to use properly, but they can be used effectively. This would involve property like metadata of the file. So who created the file, right? If it's a Microsoft Office document, who created it? Who is the author? What is the timestamp of the document? An example of this is you can look at the timestamp of when the file was created versus how long it took to edit the file. So Microsoft Office has an interesting property called edit time, and it will basically show the total edit time of the file. So if you see that the file was created on, I don't know, 1 p.m. on Thursday, and the total edit time is under 1 minute, that's something suspicious, because, I mean, most users, if they're creating a document, they're going to spend more than 1 minute in that document. But however, if you're a malware author and you're generating malware in mass, in large quantities, you're not going to spend too much time on a document. It's just going to take seconds to generate this, depending on what kind of tools you use. So before I go into how we can develop use cases around malware, we need to look at what a typical malware architecture looks like. So almost all malware has these three components: a dropper component, a payload component, and a command and control component. The dropper is responsible for downloading the next stages and payloads in the malware. Droppers typically look like Office documents. It could be a PDF or a RTF, like a rich text format document, or an Excel, PowerPoint, Word. It's typically in the form of documents sent via email. And this would usually contain embedded code. It could be macro code or shell code, something like this. But ultimately, I won't get into the details of technical details of shell code and things. But basically, it would be embedded code that executes and downloads the next stages of the malware, which is the payload. The payload is the malware's main code and functionality. The payload is responsible for the primary capabilities of the malware. So whatever the malware's purpose is, that's what the payload does. So if the malware's purpose is for espionage, it wants to steal data, that's part of the payload. Or if the malware wants to, ransom your endpoints, that would be the ransomware. Then is the payload in this case. And finally, almost all malware has command and control components, and this would involve reaching back out to the attacker's infrastructure to get commands. This could be part of a botnet, for example, like Emotet, where the infected endpoint is now considered a bot, and the bot controller is the C2, the command and control server, and then they issue commands to their bots. Or this could be a simple server that the attacker has set up that receives data from the malware somehow. But either way, it's network communication. When we're talking about what kind of techniques each of these components use, we can look at these. In deeper here. So for example, the droppers, if we're talking about a document, we're talking about a lot of Windows tools, Windows native tools being used, like PowerShell or cmd.exe or WMI or WMIC. All of these living off the LAN binaries, all these Windows binaries are used nowadays for dropping. Obviously, this is just an example. There's a lot of different ways to drop additional malware on the host, but these are some of the most common ones. So the payload will attempt to establish persistence, possibly escalate privileges, and a number of other actions. So all of these actions can be used to develop use cases for hunting and for detection. And finally, the command and control communication is a great way to develop a hunt or detection. This is kind of going into the IOC category, like indicators of compromise, which we'll discuss in a bit. But let's look at some examples of use cases that could be created. I picked two. One of my favorites, of course, everybody's favorite right now is Cobalt Strike beacons. So I use that as an example. The other one is Iced ID, which is if you work in the financial industry and you like malware, you probably know what Iced ID is. It's basically a banking Trojan. But in the case of Cobalt Strike, let's pretend I somehow obtained a Cobalt Strike beacon maybe my antivirus triggered this, or maybe one of my users received a phishing email and they sent it to me. So now I want to analyze this, and it turns out to be a Cobalt Strike beacon. So after analyzing the attack, after submitting it to a sandbox for analysis, I now have some methods of detecting and hunting for this technique now. So for example, the dropper component, in this case, it was Microsoft Office, so we'll say Word. It spawns rundll32.exe, which attempts to contact a domain on the internet. So just these three things right here could help you develop an interesting threat hunt or detection rule. So if you, for example, were to run a detection rule or a threat hunt for any Microsoft Office product that has a child process or spawns rundll32.exe, which then connects to the internet, you may have some kind of a dropper on your hands here. And then the payload is injected into rundll32 process, and the beacon establishes persistence via a specific scheduled task. So here you could look for process injection into rundll32.exe. One small comment on process injection: it's very difficult to detect process injection without a fully functional EDR. So this part would be hard for many organizations, but you could for sure run a hunt or detection rule for persistence that's established via scheduled task. And then we have the command and control from the beacon, which in this particular beacon, it contacted a specific domain. I didn't list the domain here. I just used a generic domain, specific domain. But every 25 seconds, it would contact this domain. That's what a beacon does. It just basically beacons out or calls out to the C2 every 25 seconds. And it uses a specific user agent. So what can we do here to develop a threat hunt or a detection rule? So we could take each of these individual blocks and develop one rule or one hunt. If you took this block, you might be able to find some interesting things. For example, you probably would find some droppers, but there would probably also be some false positives. But if you took all three blocks and developed one threat hunt or one detection rule for all three, you're probably looking at an actual Cobalt Strike infection in your environment, or at least a malware that looks a lot like Cobalt Strike. So the more blocks you use here in your rules, or in your use cases, excuse me, the more granular and accurate you'll get, the less false positives you will get, but also you'll be casting a smaller net. So when you're doing a threat hunt, sometimes it's better to cast a wider net, so that way you can have your threat hunters look at the data and narrow down what they want to focus on. However, if you're creating a detection rule, you probably want to cast a smaller net, so that way your SOC isn't overwhelmed with alerts. So it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish here. But with iced ID, it's a little bit, you can also map it to dropper payload and command and control, similar to Cobalt Strike. In this case, iced ID was being delivered via a Microsoft Office document, which executes PowerShell, which further invokes MSHTA, which is the Microsoft HTML application binary, and it downloads a file using this. So if you did a threat hunt in your organization and you looked for any Microsoft Office product that spawns PowerShell, and then finally mshta.exe, you probably would find some really interesting things. You may not find iced ID, for example, but you would find very likely, find malware doing this in your environment. Because, I mean, what are the chances of, an actual user doing all of this? I mean, users do some crazy things, don't get me wrong, but will a user in your environment spawn PowerShell and MSHTA from Office? The answer is probably yes, but not many will be doing this. So the payload in this case is downloaded to a very interesting directory, cprogramfiles.jpg. And the JPEG has a wildcard in there because iced ID randomizes its payload name. So it could be like a random number or character set.jpg. But the interesting thing about this is a JPEG file should never be sitting in C program files. If you go on your computer right now and see a JPEG in C program files, let me know for sure, so I can tune my threat hunting and detection rules. But this is almost never going to be in program files. So in this case, if I ran a thread hunt for a JPEG file in program files, and I found a JPEG file in an endpoint on my host or on my network, this is something I'd probably want to investigate. And then further, iced-id is also executed via regserver32.exe. It's another Windows binary, but basically regserver32 invokes this file here. So you could also run a thread hunt or create a detection rule for any instances of regserver32 executing a file from this path here. And finally, iced-id has some very specific C2 communication. In this case, I X'd out here the actual IP, which is really not important here. The important thing is this parameter, r equals 108. R equals 108 is actually the version number of iced-id. So what I thought of doing here was you could take this threat hunter detection rule in two different ways. You could either search for this exact URL in your environment, and if you found this exact URL, then likely you have a problem and you need to investigate. However, you also would you'd get almost no false positives from this, but you also would not get a lot of true positives either, because this is a very small net here. But if you look just for r equals 108, so put a wildcard here, and look for any domain or any IP address, and then look for r equals 108 in the URI path, then now you're looking at probably if iced-id is targeting your organization, you may find some interesting things here, because I would think that a lot of your traffic in your network doesn't have r equals 108 in it. So there's a good chance that it would be malicious if you found that. I mean, obviously there will be some false positives, but if you're doing a threat hunt, you want false positives. So everyone knows the pyramid of pain, or not everybody. I'm guessing many people on this call know, especially if you're on the blue team, you know the pyramid of pain, but it talks about basically how challenging it is to do threat hunts and create detections based on different aspects of IOCs or behaviors in malware or in just in general threats. But when we're focused on concrete IOCs, it's going to result in high accuracy and low false positives, but also less findings. So concrete IOCs in this case are, so for example, if you analyze a malware and it's calling out to evil.com, and then you run a search or a hunt for evil.com, that's a concrete IOC. So you will find, or you may find, hosts in your environment calling out to evil.com, and this is a pretty good indicator that the host is infected. However, the threat actor can easily change their C2 infrastructure. So they may be calling out to evil1.com or evil2.com, and you would miss this. So as I said, focusing on concrete IOCs is very high accuracy, low false positives, but also less overall findings. And IOCs in this case are domain names, IP addresses, or hash values. And these are really easy to search for and do hunts for, but like I said, they're not as good for casting a wide net like I mentioned earlier. And then focusing on abstract IOCs and techniques will result in more false positives but less findings. So abstract IOCs are, we'll talk about IOC extraction right now actually in a minute here, but IOC abstraction focuses more on the top aspects here. So network and host artifacts, tools, and TTPs. So yeah, let's talk about abstracting IOCs. So what I mean by abstraction is simply this. The less abstract your IOCs, the more targeted and high accuracy they are. So for example, I have an IOC here, https 45.10.20.30/fre.php. Does anyone know, well, you can't talk because you're all on mute, but if you put in the chat, does anyone know fre.php and what malware this is? Bonus, well, I can't give away prizes, but you get my respect if you put it in chat and know what it is. Anyway, so this malware is calling out to 45.10.20.30/fre.php. So this is a malware sample, and I extracted this C2 address after running it in a sandbox. A higher abstraction would just be taking fre.php. So instead of looking for this exact indicator in our environments, we can look for fre.php, and this may create some false positives, but it casts a wider net. So you basically be looking for more C2 servers that have the same FRE.php pattern. And finally, at the highest level of abstraction, we're talking about the metadata behind network communications. So beaconing intervals. So Cobalt Strike is very famous for this, right? Every 30 seconds, every 25 seconds, Cobalt Strike will beacon out to its C2, depending on how it's configured. So if you know that a certain malware family or a certain threat actor likes to do 15-second beacon intervals, then this is what you can create a detection rule for or a hunt rule for in your environment. PCAP data is another great one. If you have access to full PCAP, most organizations, well, many organizations don't have access to full PCAP, but looking at the data that the malware is actually sending to its C2 servers can create a, can help you cast a wider net. Also, user agents are really good too. So malware will send very specific network C2 communication sometimes with a custom user agent. There's a remote access Trojan called WSHRAT, which is famous for this because the user agent is WSHRAT. So if you ran a hunt in your environment for any browsers or any network communication with WSHRAT in the user agent string, then you probably have a problem. So I call this the malware analysis and use case lifecycle. This is kind of what I use to help me structure the way I try to develop malware-based threat hunts. So I try to first identify the top malware threats to my organization. This can be done a number of ways, but you can also do this through the malware sources I mentioned earlier. If you automate the process of collecting this malware and submitting it to a sandbox, the sandbox can help you with identifying what malware families these malware files are part of. So this can help you identify your top malware threats. So if you find that Iced ID or Cobalt Strike is targeting your organization a lot, or you think they're targeting your organization, choose those malwares as your focus. Then submit them to a sandbox, thoroughly analyze them. If you're fortunate enough to have a team of reverse engineers, reverse it, understand it at a very low level, and then identify key techniques and IOCs that can be used for threat hunting or for use case development for detections. Develop those use cases, and then finally test and deploy those use cases. I mean, obviously, you could argue that this is a no-brainer, and it's pretty obvious this is what you should do. But I like to guide and structure the way I do my research. So hopefully this helps somebody. So in conclusion, malware analysis can be a key input for your hunting and detection use cases. Malware analysis can be used to help prioritize detection rules. So for example, if you see a lot of malware in your environment that's using specific techniques over and over and over again, like PowerShell execution, then this could be something you want to prioritize. Maybe you should start focusing on detection rules for PowerShell and hunting rules for PowerShell. Malware analysis should not replace MITRE ATT&CK, but should complement it. As I said, it can help you prioritize your MITRE ATT&CK techniques that you want to implement. And finally, it doesn't take a full reverse engineering team to start using malware analysis for your use cases. Some organizations are fortunate enough to have a full reverse engineering team. Most organizations don't have this, but all it takes is a SOC analyst, preferably a senior SOC analyst or a threat hunter or threat intel person who understands malware at least at a high level, but ultimately they have an interest in this. And they can set up a malware sandbox, like a free one like Cuckoo, or they can use a commercial one. But all it takes is one analyst in a sandbox to start doing this. Modern sandboxes nowadays are much better than they were years ago, like even 5 years ago. They're much better. And modern sandboxes can help you with, I would say, 75 to 80% of all malware you would see. It will be able to analyze this malware for you. It will be able to extract IOCs and techniques for you. And it just really takes an analyst to understand those techniques and be able to abstract those appropriately. So, questions?
Yeah, thank you very much, Kyle, for the great talk. And there's a couple of questions from the audience. So one question. and that's whether practical detection mechanism of a process injection. What is the difference between a dropper and a downloader?
So I understood the second question, what's the difference between a dropper and a downloader, but is the first question in relation to the second, or are they two different questions?
Let's probably split them separate, the practical detection of process injection.
Okay, yeah, yep. So that's the hard question. I'll save that one for last.
Okay.
the difference between a dropper and a downloader, they're mostly used synonymously, but they do have some small differences. Typically, a dropper, it contains the malware, the payload in itself. So if you have a Microsoft Office document that actually contains the embedded executable and drops this executable to disk and runs it, a dropper is basically self-contained. It doesn't need to call it to the internet. Where a downloader needs to call it to the internet to download its second stage payload. However, dropper and downloader are used synonymously a lot of times in malware analysis. For the second question, practical ways of identifying process injection. So there's mostly two primary topics around this. One is an antivirus and the other is EDR. So antivirus can detect rudimentary process injection. Antivirus has capabilities to analyze, actually Windows Defender, for example, has a sandbox feature where it will spawn a lightweight sandbox, analyze the malware in a sandbox, detect process injection, and then if it detects process injection, it will not allow that sample to execute on the endpoint. However, this is a feature that needs to be manually enabled in Windows Defender. So for all organizations that are using Windows Defender, you can check this feature out. However, I think it's pretty heavy on system resources. Malware can also, antivirus can also heuristically detect process injection. However, process injection is not very straightforward because there's so many different ways malware authors can change the way processes or code is injected into processes, and it allows easy bypass from antivirus. EDR is much better at this. EDR, for example, CrowdStrike. I don't personally use CrowdStrike, but I've heard it's pretty good at detecting, for example, Cobalt Strike that's being injected into target processes. But like I said, process injection, you really need a good EDR solution in order to detect it. Maybe not be the answer you wanted to hear, but that's the nature of process injection. Does that answer the question?
Guy, if you just want to write this in the chat with the answer to the question, otherwise we can just, great, thank you. There's another question from the audience regarding how your malware analysis environment looks like. Can you share your security measures that you take during the handling of ransomware samples?
Sure. Yeah. So good question. So I'm going to try to talk about this, not actually about my work and how it's set up, but how I would set it up if I were going to do this personally or for another organization. Right. I would have a completely separate network. First of all, so if you want to create a malware analysis solution in your organization, it's best to completely separate this from the company network. So buy separate laptops. Buy some servers if you need them, maybe even just a powerful workstation that can run a sandbox. But keep these off the primary organizational network because it's too easy for the samples to automatically start spreading around. Having said that, though, there hasn't really been a lot of movement in VM or virtual machine exploitation recently. So in the past, there were a lot more exploits for example, VMware and VirtualBox, but to my knowledge, there hasn't really been a new one recently. It doesn't mean that there are none, but this is something to take into consideration. So as long as you're using a laptop or workstation that's off the company network, off of your personal network and is isolated, there's no reason why you can't run ransomware and be fine running this. My tip though is to use Windows as your analysis environment. I mean, obviously, if you're running Windows malware, use Windows, but run a host OS, something other than Windows, so Linux or Mac, for example, because that way, if the malware does happen to escape your VM, it likely can't execute in a non-Windows environment. Those are my quick tips.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Any further questions? I don't see any for none for now. I actually have a question myself, just on actually IOCs or common malware types that you see, especially in your day-to-day work in the financial industry. Which would you see as the most prevalent ones now for 2021?
Yeah, great question. Oh man, let's see here. Okay, so info stealers are still pretty heavy. Info stealers involve, once the malware infects the endpoint, it steals browser cookies, browser credentials. It's basically looking for sensitive or mostly financial related information. So credit card data, things like that. These are pretty common in the financial industry. There's another class of malware called banking Trojans. You would think banking Trojans target banks, but that's not necessarily the case. Banking Trojans are mostly on the client side, meaning that they're targeting customers or banking customers and trying to steal their data in transit as they're doing communications with the bank. So banking Trojans are not necessarily a big threat for internally for banks anyway. Of course, I'll say Emotet, but that's not around much anymore. Let's see here. I would say info stealers are the majority of them. Occasionally, finance will see second stage droppers like TrickBot or Dridex. Second stage droppers are essentially they're deployed after so the dropper will drop the second stage dropper to create a really complex situation. The second stage dropper will make sure the endpoint is safe enough to deploy the third final payload. And the third final payload may be a Trojan, or it could be, for example, ransomware or something like this. So yeah, these are the common varieties of malware that finance sees.
Thank you very much, Kyle. And there's also another question from Gulmira, whether the ACH method can contribute in the development of use cases or effective threat hunt, the analysis of competing hypotheses. I think that's the ACH method.
Ooh, you got me there. I have no idea what that is. I probably should know what that is. If you could explain it in 1 or 2 sentences, I would be able to answer the question better. Are we talking about threat hunting hypotheses or hypotheses?
I think so. Maybe Gulmira, maybe you can extend on that.
I can't actually see the chat right now because my Zoom window is weirdly frozen. Maybe you can just
Yeah, we can get back to the question later on. Great. Yeah. Again, thank you very much for this excellent presentation. I found it really useful, really seeing how malware analysis can be used to really drive your hunting and detection use cases. I mean, just from some experience working as a blue team person, I can really see like things like even simple things like using Cuckoo and just dropping in the malware can actually help you understanding it and also making a better security person. So.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you very much for sharing this. And yeah, really looking forward if you have anything further to share in the future about this.
Thanks for inviting me, of course.
Thank you. Great. And I'm going to share my screen quickly. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
All right. And yep.
Oh, sorry, Dan. I just wanted to say some people were actually talking about the malware that I mentioned. I asked the audience what the malware is. I think somebody said Loki
bot. Yes.
Exactly.
So,
very good.
Yeah.
So Gulmira, I think, first said it. Congratulations. I don't have any money for you or anything, but you have my respect.
Great. Thank you very much. And yeah, I really liked it. There was a couple of people discussing this. So there you go. 10 points. Great. I think we shouldn't do another break because we're almost at the end of this meetup. Just like to spend a couple of more minutes on Project Spotlight and then the plan for the next meetup. First of all, Kai, can you see my screen, or can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. All right, and let's just continue quickly with our Project Spotlight. And what we aim to do with this one is showing you one of our really cool flagship projects each time, and just showing you maybe how we could use this and benefit for your organization. Today's Project Spotlight is the OWASP Software Assurance Maturity Model, or also called SAM. And as I said, it's a flagship OWASP project, and it aims to provide a measurable way of analyzing and improving your software security posture. So if you're working in a software security program or you're working as a product security engineer, this is definitely an interesting project to spotlight and just to check out. And the goal of this is also aiming to raise awareness and educate organizations on the secure software development lifecycle. The SAM itself is divided in so-called business functions like governance, design, implementation, and verifications, as well as operations. And within that, there is like certain types of security practices like threat assessment. I found myself that OWASP SAM really useful when working together with a customer on improving their software security program by really looking on things in the design phase, like how can we improve our threat assessment by introducing threat modeling, continuous threat modeling throughout the SDLC, but also looking at application risk profiling and building that out. So if you're interested in learning more, go on owaspsam.org and just read through the content. It's all open source, it's available. And if you have any questions, just reach out to the OWASP SAM authors on Slack or just check out the GitHub page. Otherwise, our upcoming meetup for next time, we are delighted to announce that our next meetup is going to be all around vulnerability research and zero-day exploitation. Our next OWASP meetup is, as commonly, the last Wednesday of the month. And we are delighted to have Felix Costerhorn and Ramon Weil from Secure Infra talking about the vulnerability research of the Linux Oddity framework and how through researching that framework, they were able to find a zero-day that is now labeled as a CVE 2020-355001. After that, we are going to have a lightning talk from Matthias Altmann from Micromata, talking about a so-called malicious DOM cloring technique and how he is able to inject malicious code via using this attack. This is also going to be quite interesting if you're working as a pen tester or application security analyst and want to learn more about new attacks. Again, there's also going to be another speaker likely to be attending. If you're interested in public speaking yourself, or you feel you just have to say something to the community, free to get in touch with Johannes or me and let us know if you want to give a talk. Otherwise, yeah, save the date for the 25th of August. Also, if you want to follow us on Twitter, there is both the OWASP_Frankfurt Twitter as well as the OWASP_DE Twitter channel to join. And there's a lot, especially the German one, has a lot of interesting posts all around what's been happening around the German security community. And also the meetup itself. I mean, you probably know this by yourself, just found it, but just keep watching the meetup page for our upcoming meetups. Another point that we really like to highlight is the Slack channel. The OWASP Slack channel has around 3,000 to 5,000 security professionals, and any sort of material, anything you want to learn or know more about OWASP or OWASP related material, just go to the Slack channel and check out, like there's, I think, probably several hundred channels, and ask your questions there, especially if you want to get, for example, in contact with some of the authors for certain OWASP projects. Also, there's a German chapter channel, like the chapter Germany channel. Definitely check that out. And also in terms of our website, again, we will be putting up the videos and the slides in the upcoming days, 3 to 5 days, to our meetup page and as well as to the OWASP Frankfurt Stammtisch page, and also make the YouTube recording available on Zoom. And if you want to know anything more or anything else, just get in touch with us or just check out the OWASP Chapter Germany Stammtisch Frankfurt website. Also, just a kind reminder for everybody is please provide us with your feedback. If you liked something or if you didn't like something, please let us know. We would be delighted just for us to improve ourselves and make this meetup, keep this meetup growing and keep this meetup more interesting every time. Also, if you have any ideas for certain talks, like if you want to hear something more about red teaming or blue teaming, please post your suggestions and ideas in the feedback channel. We're really delighted to hear more from you. And also, I'll just keep the poll open and we'll go through that afterwards. Finally, Again, thank you very much both for our amazing speakers, Rory and for Kyle, about their excellent presentations about container orchestration and malware analysis. I was able to learn quite a lot looking at both sides, more coming from cloud security, but really understanding how containers are essentially remote code execution as a service, as well as looking at Kyle's presentation about malware analysis, how this can actually benefit your threat hunting exercises. So thank you very much for sharing that. And also thank you very much for the audience for attending and being available and asking really good questions. And again, I would like to ask everybody just to stay on the call. If you want to do some socializing, we will be just turn off the recording in a minute, and feel free to unmute yourself, turn on your video, and just have a quick chat, and maybe just give us some feedback. Thank you very much.